I bought keys from the dark web. They opened my dead grandpa house. Hey Reddit, I'm not sure why I'm even writing this. Maybe it's because I need to get it off my chest, or maybe because I'm hoping someone out there has gone through something similar and can tell me how to make it stop. Here it goes. It all started a few weeks ago. I've always been into weird shit. You know, the kind of stuff you find on the dark web. I know, it's a bad idea, but I've always been curious. Anyway, I came across this listing. It was simple, just a photo of a set of old rusty keys with the caption, "Keys to your past. $50. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was boredom or just the need for a thrill. I bought them. They arrived in a plain, unmarked envelope 3 days later. When I opened it, I felt this weird sense of déjà vu. The keys looked ancient, each one different from the other. I noticed one in particular that seemed familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. It wasn't until a week later, when I went to my parents' house for dinner, that it hit me. My mom had been digging through old family photos and came across one of my grandpa's old house. The house had been abandoned for years after he died. It was in the middle of nowhere, and no one had bothered to clean it out or sell it. The keys in the photo, hanging on a hook by the door, were identical to the ones I'd received. I didn't tell my parents about the keys. I didn't want to freak them out. But I couldn't get it out of my head. That night, I decided to go to my grandpa's house. It was a 2-hour drive, and by the time I got there it was pitch black and the air was thick with fog. The house stood there, looming in the dark. It looked like something out of a horror movie. The windows were broken, the paint was peeling, and the front door was slightly ajar. I parked my car and walked up to the front door, the keys clutched in my hand. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a chill run down my spine. The house smelled musty, like it hadn't been touched in decades. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The place was a mess. Furniture was overturned and there was dust and cobwebs everywhere. I started walking through the house, checking each room. It was as if time had frozen. I finally reached my grandpa's old study. The door was closed, but I could hear something faint on the other side. It sounded like whispering. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried the first key. It didn't fit. Neither did the second or third. But the fourth one turned the lock with a loud click. The whispering stopped the moment I opened the door. I shone my light inside and nearly dropped my phone. The room was filled with photos. Hundreds of them, pinned to the walls, scattered on the floor, covering the desk. They were all of me. From the time I was a baby up until a few weeks ago. Some of the more recent ones looked like they were taken without my knowledge, like someone had been following me. In the center of the room was a single chair, facing away from me. I couldn't see who or what was sitting in it, but I could see the outline of a figure. I called out, but there was no response. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw it. It was my grandpa. Or at least, what was left of him. His body was decomposed, his skin dry and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were wide open, staring at me, and his mouth was hanging open in a silent scream. But that wasn't the worst part. In his lap was a photo album, open to a page with a picture of me, asleep in my bed. And next to him, on the floor, was a note. It read, "I've been waiting for you." I don't know how I managed to get out of that house. I remember running, not looking back, feeling like something was chasing me. I drove back home in a daze, my mind racing. I couldn't make sense of it. How did those photos get there? How long had he been watching me? And why did he have those keys? When I got back home, I checked my room. It was exactly as I had left it. But something felt off. I searched everywhere, looking for hidden cameras, anything that might explain those photos. But I found nothing. I haven't slept since that night. Every time I close my eyes I see his face, hear those whispers. I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm losing my mind. And then, last night, I found another note. It was on my pillow. It simply said, "I'm still waiting. I can't stay here. I don't feel safe, but where can I go? And how do I make it stop?" I didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The note on my pillow haunted me. "I'm still waiting." What the hell did that even mean? By morning, I was a mess. I knew I couldn't stay in my house, but I had no idea where to go. I decided to head to a friend's place. Let's call him Mike. He was the kind of guy who didn't ask too many questions and had always been there for me. I packed a bag and drove over. Mike lived in a small apartment downtown. When I showed up at his door, he could tell something was wrong. I didn't tell him everything. just that I needed a place to crash for a few days. He didn't press me for details, just handed me a beer and told me to make myself at home. That night, I felt a little better, knowing I wasn't alone. Mike and I stayed up watching old horror movies, trying to laugh off the tension. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was like a shadow that hung over me, no matter what I did. Around midnight, Mike crashed on the couch, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I decided to check my phone. I hadn't really looked at it since leaving my house. There were a few missed calls and texts, nothing important. Then, as I was scrolling, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an unknown sender. The subject line was just a single word. Soon. My heart skipped a beat. I opened it, my hands shaking. The email was blank, except for an attachment. It was a photo. Of me. Sitting in Mike's living room, beer in hand, staring at my phone. The timestamp showed it was taken just a few minutes ago. I jumped up, looking around wildly. There was no way someone could have taken that photo. The door was locked and all the windows were shut. I checked them all, just to be sure. Nothing. No sign of forced entry, no hidden cameras. Nothing. I woke Mike up, freaking out. He tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just a prank. But I could see the worry in his eyes. He agreed to stay up with me, and we double-checked everything. We didn't find anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We stayed up the rest of the night, jumping at every sound. By morning, we were both exhausted. Mike had to go to work, but he promised to check in on me throughout the day. I stayed in his apartment, too scared to leave. Around noon, there was a knock on the door. My heart raced as I approached, peeking through the peephole. It was a delivery guy, holding a small package. I opened the door, my mind racing with possibilities. He handed me the package and left without a word. I took the package inside and stared at it for a long time before opening it. It was a small, plain box, no return address. Inside was another set of keys, identical to the ones I had bought from the dark web. And another note. Come back, we need to finish this. I felt sick. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. I called Mike, telling him what had happened. He was just as freaked out as I was. He suggested going back to my grandpa's house, trying to find some answers. I didn't want to go back there, but what choice did I have? I needed to know what was going on. Mike agreed to come with me after work. The hours dragged by as I waited for him. Every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed to hide some unseen horror. Finally, he showed up and we headed out. The drive to my grandpa's house was even more nerve-wracking this time. The fog was thicker, the night darker. When we arrived, the house looked even more foreboding than before. We parked the car and approached the door, the new set of keys in my hand. Inside, the house was just as I had left it. The same musty smell, the same eerie silence. We made our way to the study and I hesitated at the door. I could hear the whispering again, faint but unmistakable. Mike urged me on, and I reluctantly unlocked the door. The study was just as before, filled with photos of me. But this time, the chair was empty. I stepped inside, my flashlight sweeping the room. That's when I saw it. A trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden under the desk. It was slightly ajar, the darkness below seeming to pulse with an unnatural energy. Mike and I exchanged a look and he nodded. We moved the desk aside and pulled open the trapdoor. A set of stairs led down into the darkness. The whispering grew louder, almost frantic. We descended slowly, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, we found a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center of the room was a table. On it lay a book, bound in what looked like human skin. Next to it was another photo. Of me and Mike, standing at the top of the stairs. I picked up the book, my hands trembling. It felt warm, almost alive. The pages were filled with more of the strange symbols, along with drawings of horrific twisted creatures. But the last page was the worst. It showed a drawing of me, lying dead in a pool of blood, with the words, "It's your turn." I dropped the book, stumbling back. Mike grabbed my arm, and we ran. Up the stairs, through the house and out into the night. We didn't stop until we were back in the car, driving away as fast as we could. We didn't talk about what we had seen, not then. I'm not sure either of us could process it. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just a coincidence. Something was targeting me, and it wasn't going to stop. When we got back to Mike's apartment, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. We had escaped the house, but I knew it wasn't over. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, something unseen and malevolent. And the worst part? I had no idea how to stop it. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and fear. I couldn't go back to my house, and staying with Mike was only a temporary solution. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was being watched. It was like an invisible presence, always just out of sight, always just out of reach. Mike tried to keep things normal, but I could see the strain it was putting on him. We both knew we couldn't keep this up. Then things got worse. It started with the dreams. Every night, I'd find myself back in my grandpa's house, wandering through the dark, empty rooms. The whispers were louder, almost deafening. I'd see flashes of horrible things, bodies hanging from the ceiling, their eyes wide open and staring. Shadowy figures lurking in the corners, their faces twisted into grotesque grins. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the whispers still echoing in my ears. One night, I woke up to find Mike standing over me, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He'd been having the same dreams. We both knew it wasn't a coincidence. Whatever was haunting me was now haunting him too. We decided to get help. We contacted a local paranormal investigator, a guy named Carl. He had a reputation for dealing with weird cases, and he didn't ask too many questions. We met him at a diner, explaining everything that had happened. He listened quietly, nodding occasionally. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Sounds like you've got yourself a serious problem," he said. "I've dealt with similar cases before, but this one feels different. Darker." He agreed to come back to my grandpa's house with us. He wanted to do a thorough investigation, see if he could find any clues about what was going on. We were desperate for answers, so we agreed. The three of us drove out there the next night. The fog was even thicker this time, the darkness even more oppressive. When we arrived, the house looked like it was waiting for us, its broken windows like eyes staring into our souls. Carl led the way, carrying a bag filled with equipment. Inside, the house was eerily silent, the air heavy with an unspoken threat. Carl set up his gear, placing cameras and sensors around the rooms. He lit some sage and started chanting, trying to cleanse the space. Mike and I watched, hoping he knew what he was doing. As Carl worked, the temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath in the air, feel the cold seeping into my bones. The whispers started again, faint at first, but growing louder. Carl didn't seem to notice, his focus entirely on his ritual. Then the lights went out. We were plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of Carl's equipment. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices all around us. I felt something brush against my arm, cold and clammy. I screamed, stumbling back, crashing into Mike. Carl shouted something, but his words were lost in the noise. I saw shadows moving in the darkness, closing in on us. Mike grabbed my hand, pulling me towards the door, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped. Carl reached into his bag, pulling out a small vial of liquid. He threw it onto the floor, and there was a blinding flash of light. The whispers stopped and the shadows vanished. The lights flickered back on and we were alone in the room, panting and shaking. "What the hell was that?" Mike demanded, his voice trembling. Carl looked shaken, his face pale. "That was something I've never encountered before," he admitted. "Whatever is in this house, it's powerful. And it's not going to let you go easily." We spent the next few hours trying to figure out what to do. Carl suggested we leave the house, get some distance, but I knew it wouldn't help. Whatever this thing was, it was tied to me. Running wouldn't solve anything. As we were packing up to leave, I found another note. It was on the floor, right where Carl had thrown the vial. I picked it up, my hands shaking. "You can't escape, you belong to us now." I showed the note to Carl and Mike. Their faces went white. We knew we couldn't stay there, but we didn't know where else to go. We left the house, driving back to Mike's apartment in silence. When we got back, we tried to come up with a plan. Carl suggested researching my grandpa, trying to find out if there was anything in his past that could explain what was happening. Mike and I agreed, desperate for any kind of lead. The next day, we went through my grandpa's old records, searching for anything unusual. We found old diaries, letters and photos, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then we found an old box, hidden in the back of his closet. Inside were more of the strange symbols, along with a journal. The journal belonged to my grandpa. It detailed his descent into madness, his obsession with the occult. He'd performed rituals, trying to summon something from beyond. The last entry was the most disturbing. "I've done it. I've opened the door. But now, I can't close it. They're here. And they want my bloodline." We realized that whatever my grandpa had summoned, it was after me. It had been waiting for me to come to the house, and now it wasn't going to stop until it had me. We were out of options. Carl suggested one last thing, a ritual to banish the entity. It was risky and there was no guarantee it would work, but it was our only shot. We gathered the supplies we needed and prepared for the ritual. That night, we went back to my grandpa's house. The air was thick with tension, the fog wrapping around us like a shroud. Inside the house felt alive, the whispers louder than ever. We set up in the study, the trapdoor still open in the floor. Carl started the ritual, chanting in a language I didn't understand. Mike and I held hands, trying to stay calm. The air grew colder, the whispers turning into screams. The shadows began to move, circling us, closing in. Then everything went silent. For a moment I thought it had worked. The house was still, the air warm. But then, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned and there was my grandpa, his eyes wide and filled with rage. He grabbed me, pulling me towards the trapdoor. Mike and Carl tried to stop him, but it was like they couldn't see him. I struggled, but his grip was like iron. He dragged me down into the darkness. The last thing I saw was Mike's terrified face. I was pulled into the darkness, the cold grip of my grandpa's hand feeling like ice on my skin. My screams echoed off the walls as I was dragged deeper and deeper into the abyss. The air was thick, almost suffocating. And the whispers surrounded me, growing louder and more frantic. Then, abruptly, I was released. I fell to the ground, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I lay there, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of my surroundings. It was pitch black, but I could feel a cold damp floor beneath me. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The light revealed a narrow, stone-walled corridor, slick with moisture. The air was heavy with the smell of mold and decay. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in from all sides. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling, and started to walk. As I moved through the corridor, I noticed strange symbols carved into the walls, similar to the ones in my grandpa's journal. They seemed to glow faintly in the light, pulsing with a life of their own. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I turned a corner and came face to face with a door. It was old and heavy, made of dark wood with iron bands. It looked ancient, out of place in the otherwise featureless corridor. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, turning it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in an unnatural red light. Inside, the room was filled with more of the strange symbols, painted on the walls and floor in what looked like blood. In the center of the room was an altar, and on it lay another photo. This one was of me, but it was different. I was lying on the ground, my eyes closed, and my throat was slit. Blood pooled around my head and my skin was ashen. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The room grew colder, the red light intensifying. I heard a low growl and turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was my grandpa, but twisted and distorted. His skin was gray and rotting, his eyes black pits. His mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing sharp broken teeth. He moved towards me with a jerky, unnatural gait, his eyes locked onto mine. "You shouldn't have come back," he rasped, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. "You belong to us now." I backed away, my mind racing. There had to be a way out. I scanned the room, looking for anything that could help me. My eyes landed on the symbols on the walls. They seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, drawing me in. I didn't know what else to do. I reached out and touched one of the symbols. A jolt of energy shot through me and the room was filled with a blinding light. The figure of my grandpa screamed, his form flickering and distorting. I felt a surge of power, and the symbols on the walls began to glow brighter. The light intensified, and the room started to shake. The figure of my grandpa exploded into a cloud of darkness, dissipating into the air. The door behind me flew open, and I didn't hesitate. I ran, not looking back, the whispers chasing me down the corridor. I burst out of the trapdoor and into the study, collapsing onto the floor. Mike and Carl were there, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. They helped me up, their questions tumbling out in a frantic rush. I told them everything, my voice shaking. Carl looked grim, his face set in a hard line. "We need to finish this," he said. "There's one more thing we can try, but it's dangerous. If we fail, you could be trapped there forever." I didn't have a choice. I couldn't keep living like this, haunted by whatever my grandpa had summoned. I agreed, and we prepared for the final ritual. Carl explained that we needed to draw the entity into a physical form, then trap it using a binding spell. It required a lot of energy, and there was a risk that the entity could overpower us. But it was our only shot. We gathered the supplies and set up in the study. Carl drew a large circle on the floor, inscribing it with the strange symbols. Mike and I stood at the edges, holding candles. Carl started the incantation, his voice strong and steady. The air grew cold again, the whispers returning. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting. A dark shape began to form in the center of the circle, coalescing into a humanoid figure. It was my grandpa, but more monstrous, more twisted. His eyes burned with a malevolent light, and his mouth twisted into a snarl. Carl continued the incantation, his voice rising in intensity. The figure of my grandpa roared, lashing out at the edges of the circle. The candles flickered, and the symbols on the floor glowed brighter. Then everything happened at once. The figure lunged at me, but was stopped by an invisible barrier. It screamed in rage, its form flickering. Carl finished the incantation, and there was a blinding flash of light. When the light faded, the figure was gone. The room was still, the air warm. The whispers had stopped. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a sense of relief washing over me. Carl slumped to the floor, exhausted. Mike and I helped him up, thanking him for his help. We left the house, the first rays of dawn breaking through the fog. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The house stood silent, its secrets buried. But I knew it wasn't over. Whatever my grandpa had summoned was still out there, waiting. And it would be back. We didn't talk much on the drive back. Carl was too exhausted to say anything, and Mike and I were too shaken. The air felt lighter, but there was an undercurrent of dread that we couldn't shake off. When we got back to Mike's apartment, we tried to decompress, but the events of the past few days weighed heavily on us. Carl left, promising to check in on us in a few days. Mike and I sat in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say. Eventually, Mike suggested we try to get some sleep. We needed it after everything we'd been through. That night, I slept for the first time in what felt like forever. No dreams, no whispers, just a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke up, the sun was shining, and for a moment I thought it was all over. But then I saw the new note on my pillow. "You can't escape." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I showed the note to Mike and his face went pale. We knew we couldn't stay at his apartment anymore. We packed our things and decided to stay at a hotel while we figured out our next move. At the hotel, I called Carl and told him about the note. He sounded concerned, but he had no immediate solutions. "Whatever it is, it's tied to you," he said. "We need to figure out why." We spent the next few days researching my grandpa's past, trying to find any clue that could help us. We combed through old records, talked to family members, and even visited some of his old haunts. We discovered that he had been involved in some dark occult practices, but nothing that explained the connection to me. One night, as I was going through my grandpa's old journal again, I found something I had missed before. There was a hidden compartment in the back cover. Inside was a small, folded piece of paper. It was a letter, addressed to me. "My dearest grandson. If you are reading this, then it means my actions have come back to haunt you. I am sorry for what I have done, for the burden I have placed on you. The entity I summoned is bound to our bloodline. It seeks to consume our souls, to draw us into its darkness. There is one way to stop it. You must perform a final ritual, one that will sever the bond and banish the entity forever. The instructions are in this letter. Be warned, it is dangerous, and if you fail, you will be lost to the darkness. I pray you find the strength to do what I could not. I am so sorry. Love, Grandpa." My hands shook as I read the letter. It was our only hope. I showed it to Mike and Carl, and we agreed to perform the ritual that night. We gathered the supplies we needed and returned to my grandpa's house one last time. The house loomed in the darkness, a silent sentinel to our nightmare. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the whispers starting again. We set up in the study, following the instructions in the letter. Carl drew a new circle on the floor, inscribing it with the symbols. Mike and I stood at the edges, holding candles. Carl began the incantation, his voice strong and steady. The air grew colder, the whispers louder. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting. The dark shape began to form in the center of the circle, coalescing into the monstrous figure of my grandpa. "You can't escape," it snarled, its voice a chorus of agony. Carl's voice rose in intensity, the incantation reaching its climax. The figure roared, lashing out at the edges of the circle. The candles flickered, the symbols on the floor glowing brighter. I felt a surge of energy, the air crackling with power. Then the entity lunged at me. I held my ground, repeating the final words of the incantation. The figure screamed, its form flickering and distorting. The light grew blinding, and the room shook violently. With a final, deafening roar, the entity exploded into a cloud of darkness, dissipating into the air. The light faded, the room growing still. The whispers had stopped and the air felt warm again. We stood in silence, the weight of what we had done settling over us. The house was finally quiet, its secrets laid to rest. We left, the first rays of dawn breaking through the fog. As we drove away, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The nightmare was finally over. But I knew it would stay with me, a dark shadow in the back of my mind. I had faced the darkness and survived, but it had left its mark. Back at the hotel, Mike and I sat in silence, exhausted but relieved. Carl checked in on us, ensuring we were okay. We thanked him for his help, knowing we couldn't have done it without him. The next few days were a blur of trying to return to normalcy. It wasn't easy, but we managed. I moved out of my old house, unable to shake the memories of what had happened there. Mike and I stayed in touch, our bond stronger than ever. One night, a few weeks later, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. The events of the past month still haunted me, but I was starting to move on. Just as I was drifting off, I heard a faint whisper. "You can't escape." My eyes snapped open, my heart racing. I looked around, but there was nothing there. The room was quiet, the air still. I told myself it was just my imagination, a leftover fear from everything that had happened. But deep down, I knew the truth. The darkness was still out there, waiting. And one day, it would come for me again.